Thanks, Sivia, and thanks everybody for spending a little bit of time with us today. You should see a poll up on your screen. We'd love to know a little bit about where you are in your SOC2 journey. Now, SOC2 is something that's a little near and dear to our hearts here at Fugue. Not only do we run and operate a SaaS product ourselves, but that product, one of the things it does is it can identify SOC2 violations in your cloud infrastructure environment. So we pay a lot of attention to this. And SOC2 is critically important in our industry for building trust with our customers and the public at large, but that's little consolation to those who are responsible for leading their organization through a SOC2 audit, which can be just a little bit anxiety producing and stressful. And it can feel pretty complex, and hopefully today will help alleviate some of that. We have to do that is Amelia Peklar, our product manager here at Fugue, and Wayne Chrisman, Fugue's Director of Security. I will be back a little bit later on to facilitate your questions. And with that, I will send it on over to Wayne. Take it away, Wayne.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time while we start digging into what SOC2 excuse me, is all about. So we'll just to lay out kind of what we'll be talking about at a high level. So we will start by laying the groundwork with some basic ideas and concepts. Then we'll start at that 30,000 foot view, including a sort of pre-audit. So we'll dig into what that means. I want to talk about just disambiguating some commonly misused terms that I hear frequently, but mean very specific things. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll start zooming in from that 30,000 foot view, talk about what makes up a SOC2 audit, and then followed by a deep dive into security. And then lastly, we'll end on some things that we've learned and things that hopefully will help you make the best of your SOC2 audit. So to just start with some of the basics, some of this is going to be term definition, some of it's going to be examples, but just getting started, you'll hear service quite often. Service is just the offering for your customers or your SaaS product. A lot of times, SaaS products are what you see becoming SOC2 certified, and as Drew said, in our case, this is Fugue, that's our product, and that's what we would be talking about in this context. You'll see organization or entity, that's you, that's your company. Again, in our case, that's Fugue. You'll hear about compliance standards, or you might even hear the term family, and really that's just a set of rules such as NIST 853, the CIS benchmarks, and today we're talking about SOC2, which is itself a compliance standard. And a single rule is an explicit regulation or some principle that should be adhered to. So, for example, from SOC2, one of the rules is, and I'll read this as dry as it may seem, the entity identifies and maintains confidential information to meet the entity's objectives related to confidentiality. So there's a fair amount to unpack there, which we won't do right now, but the term confidentiality jumps right out immediately. And there are also some security implications in that as well. And we'll kind of dive into all that a little bit later. And then finally, the controls are your policies, your guidelines that you use, your organization uses to mitigate the risks to your business and address the rules as laid out in the standard or family. So for example, you might use services such as AWS KMS for performing encryption at rest. That's a control that you can implement to fulfill the rules that are laid out in the compliance family. You might use another AWS example. You might use IAM for user and resource permissions. Another example of a set of controls. So now that we got some of the basics out of the way, let's talk about an overview. We'll start taking a look at this whole thing. What is SOC? What does it stand for? And the terminology or the term stands for service. I've also heard system. So service organizational controls. And we just talked about what all of that means. So breaking that down into a much longer version of that answer, it is the set of policies or procedures or even the technology that you or your company establishes to fulfill the rules that are relevant to the thing you provide to your customers. And so why do you need it? Why do you care? you may have a need or you may have a requirement to have an independent or accredited auditor state that you have the appropriate safeguards in place. Anybody can say it, but it's really useful when someone who's third party, not associated with your business, will put their stamp of approval on it. And this is also extremely useful when you want to engage a vendor. Drew mentioned establishing trust. So if you are looking to do something like store all of your production login credentials, a very good mark of a password manager or some place to store your credentials is, are they SOC2 certified in some way? And you can ask them for their reports. And if they're able to tell you, yes, we're SOC2 certified, here's the evidence. That's a great way to establish trust between yourself and your vendors. So I mentioned about a pre-audit or a preparation phase, and that's what readiness reviews and remediation are all about. A readiness review is it's almost like a mock audit. It's not exactly the same, but it's almost like a mock audit. And so what you would do is you engage with an auditor, and they come on site, or maybe they do it remotely. Ask you a series of questions. They may send you spreadsheets to fill out. They may ask for evidence to answer your questions or to back up your answers to your questions. And from there, they'll establish or they'll provide you rather with a gap report. And that gap report it states where you are today and where you need to be before you begin your actual audit. And the time between those two events is the remediation period. That's the period of time where you will address the gaps, start fixing things, start implementing policies, procedures, and so forth in order to meet the standards as outlined by SOC. And that time frame it really depends on the size of your gap, and it also depends on the amount of time you can devote. So you might be talking weeks in some cases. You might be talking months, and you could be in the year time frame, depending on all of those factors. And then to even make this even a little more complicated, there's also type 1 and type 2 audits. These are kind of the two flavors of a SOC audit. So you can think of type 1 as being like a snapshot or a picture. It's a control, your set of controls at that point in time of the snapshot. Whereas a type 2 is more like a movie or a video. It's controls over some time frame. And the difference between the two is very important. Type 2 is indicative of large amounts of due diligence, a well-established process, and a commitment to adhering to these standards. So the way I like to think about it is, if you go into the hardware store and you're looking for windshield wipers, you have your good, better, and best models. A good is considered type 1, or at least what I consider. Better would be type 2 with a 6-month time frame, and then best was a type 2 12-month time frame. And so why do we have 6 and 12 months? Well, 6 months seems to be a really good indication of due diligence processes, and most organizations, that's the lowest that they will take. You may be able to get away with a 3-month, but in general, you want to shoot for that 6-month at a minimum once you start approaching your type 2 audit. And then 12 months, especially if you start stacking your audits back to back, what you're essentially saying is that I have year-round compliance all the time, and I'm constantly rolling into the next audit. So you may have heard SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3. Those are different than type 1 and type 2. So I want to spend just a second kind of disambiguating that and telling about what they mean, because they do mean different things and they're very important. So SOC 1 talks about financial reports, financial reporting. So for example, banks, that's really what a SOC 1 report, SOC 1 audit deals with. It's very different from the SOC 2 audit that we're talking about today, and controls, talks about these 5 areas here that are called the trust services criteria that we'll be dealing with, we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. Those are what we're focusing on now. And then a SOC 3 is basically the same thing as SOC 2, just has all the details removed. And so what do you mean by details? Your SOC 2 report will likely include details about your network architecture, your segmentation, possibly some intellectual property. You might have certain technologies that you use. You may not want to share the information about, the details about. All of that can be contained in your SOC 2, but it's useful to have a report that you can publicly share. And so that's what the purpose of a SOC 3 is. It's basically the seal of approval with some high-level information, but no details. You may opt to share that publicly on your website. You may create a marketing campaign around it. But I wouldn't recommend doing that with a SOC 2 report. That kind of thing you can share. It's completely up to you. But I would advise getting some kind of NDA if you were going to do that. And so now that we're starting to get into this a little deeper, let's talk about the anatomy, kind of starting to look under the hood here. What makes up an engagement? What makes up a SOC 2 audit? There are a few just these three big things here. The system description, and it kind of is what it sounds like. It's the description of your system, and by system we mean the SaaS or the thing that you are providing to your customers. The description, the write-up, in your words, what that system is, and that's what your organization will be evaluated on. So in other words, whatever you write down in the system description is what your auditor will test you on. And so that becomes very important. You may not want to include, parts of your organization in the scope. And what do I mean by scope? So you are required to talk about what data you're storing and where it is and what's protecting it. Those are the controls we talked about. The service itself, and then the systems supporting it. So your databases, the security of that, the network, how it's segmented, how do you segment your network to prevent a large blast radius? How many users with production access do you have? What are your policies around hiring and so forth? The list goes on and on and on. And then finally, the selection of the trust services criteria, the TSC, that are going to be included with your audit. That's up for you and your auditor to determine. But as we continue to kind of peel back the layers of this onion, I'm going to turn it over to Amelia, who's going to walk us through what all of these mean.
Thank you for the introduction, Wayne. Before diving into the trusted service criteria, I'd like to do another poll question, just to find out what interests you guys are most interested in. SOC 2 is built on these 5 pillars, with security being the only required for the pillar. For this webinar, I'm going to mostly be focused on the security pillar, being that it is a required pillar. So for example, if you wanted to just do the privacy pillar for your SOC 2 audit, you couldn't do that. You'd have to do privacy and security. An example where you might want to do security and privacy is if your company stores medical data, then you would really want to consider doing both of these pillars for your SOC 2 audit. An example where you might want to do availability and security is if in your SLAs you have certain availability that must be around certain times within your SLA. So you'd want to do both those pillars. Again, security is the only pillar that's required for this audit, and it's the pillar I'm going to be focusing most on in this webinar. The security pillar is built upon something known as common criteria, and there are synonyms for one another. Common criteria is the security criteria. In this webinar, I'm going to be going through these different 9 common criteria and going through it. Basically, common criteria is the minimum set of controls you need to meet to become SOC 2 compliant. In the subsequent slides, again, I'm going to go through each of these 9 common control areas and provide you with examples as well as tell you what is required with them. Something to note, you're going to notice a very common theme is there's a lot of overlap between the different common criteria. And additionally, once you meet these different controls for your common criteria, you also have to provide evidence to your auditors that you have these policies and procedures in place to support the common criteria. So for example, giving your auditors an example of your organization chart. The first common criteria I'm going to go through is control environment. The concept behind this is everything trickles down from the top. Now, what do I mean by that? It is the idea that everyone at your organization at a whole will benefit if your company follows these different guidelines, which include having a commitment to integrity and ethical values, having an independent board of directors that from different management and oversight controls, ongoing and monitoring quality of employees, and then performing regular internal audits. Some examples of evidence that you'll be asked to provide to your auditor include organizational chart, evidence that the board operates independently through a charter, HR stuff, so employee handbook, background checks, performance appraisals, define roles and responsibilities along with job descriptions, and then doing security awareness training. The next common criteria that I'll be reviewing is around communication and information. And this is really around how you communicate information internally and externally. And to reiterate, there's a lot of overlap between common criteria and one. And the examples that I'm about to give should sound familiar, as they're examples that were included in the previous slide. So this includes with common criteria, again, just internal audit, again, security awareness training upon hire, but also performing security training annually. So it's not just a one-time thing and it's done. You want to just be continually making sure your employees understand and know different security best practices. Having a security incident and response policies and procedures plan, and then making sure that plan is well documented, and then communicated throughout your organization. Defining roles and responsibilities, and then again, job descriptions. Some criteria that's only specific to common criteria 2 includes having information security policies and procedures in place, contracts and MSAs, including customer commitments. System changes are communicated to external and external users. So this means if you have a release to production, you're sending out release notes to your customers, letting them know what's in that release, and then internally communicating those changes out. And then having an external facing support system. So some examples that we use here, a few is Zendesk for our ticketing. So whenever someone has an issue, they just submit a ticket through Zendesk. We use Pengeo to get different customer requests in terms of features. And then using customer support email, just sending emails to our customers. The next common criteria I'm going to go over is risk management. And risk management is really determined by your business and what your business deems as a risk. And then once your business identifies what you deem as a risk, you then want to create a process document describing what you consider to be a risk. In addition to that, your mitigation strategies to fix those risks, along with rating levels of each of those risks. So for example, you might have something that's a high critical risk level, and you'd want to mitigate that faster, so within a 30-day period, compared to something that maybe you consider medium level and you'd want to correct that within 60 days. It's really important for you organization, just to iterate again, to define these risks and determine what your mitigation strategies are and how quickly, based on the critical level that you rate it, you're going to fix those risks. And some examples include, a technical example is if you have a public GitHub repo that you've committed access keys to. First off, the mitigation strategy is not to have a publicly facing repo. Then you'd want to have a policy in place with how often you rotate your access keys. A non-technical example, but still important, is making sure that the payroll person, for example, is stealing money for their 401k. You'd want to have controls in place to ensure that does not happen. So a mitigation strategy is to have 3 separate people review payroll to ensure that no one's committing any theft or fraud. A vendor example is, for example, if you rely on Auth0 for SSO on your production site. Any vendor that impacts your ability to run things on production is considered a critical vendor. So you'd want to ensure that if something happened, that you'd have a strategy in place to mitigate this. The next common criteria I'll be reviewing is monitoring activities. And this is really around the evaluation of an organization system. So, and again, performing another internal audit of these different procedures, and then ensuring that for whatever reason, if something happened, that you have the procedures in place to be able to notify the relevant personnel. Again, it's a very common theme if you haven't picked up on it yet, but there's lots of overlap between common criteria 3 and common criteria 4. I'm going to go through some that are specific to common criteria for, but again, there's a lot of overlap between the previous slide and this slide. But some examples include your vendor management program, your annual review of critical third-party vendors, and then ensuring, again, you have internal audit of controls. So an example is that you discover during your audit process that access logging is not enabled for your production API endpoint. Remediation of this could include communicating to your internal teams, maybe engineering, infrastructure, whoever that is on your team, that one, there is a situation. You then want to create a ticket in Jira or whatever ticket tooling you use, Trello, it doesn't matter, but you want to create a ticket so you can track that progress. And then you want to ensure that ticket goes through a change and access board. And then once you deem the fix or have a fix for it, again, you want to make sure it goes through the whole entire process. So again, if it's high or critical and your business deemed that fix needs to be done in 30 days, it is. If it's medium, 60 days, etc. But you want to ensure that whatever policies in place, that you follow those policies in place. The next common criteria I'm going to review is control activities. And this is really around your company's software development lifecycle and ensuring that your engineering team adheres to this. And it's not just about adhering, you also want to have it clearly documented. So some examples of things in your software development lifecycle that you want to have documented and ensure your engineering team's following include who approves the software changes. Are unit tests required before anything can go? Do you have any analyst tools to check different repos before your engineers can commit that code, third-party repos, into your system to ensure there's no critical vulnerabilities? And then ensuring that all this stuff is very well documented. Again, there's a lot of overlap between this, the security policies, your risk management program, your incident response, and tracking systems such as Jira. So in addition to this, you want to ensure that you have a very clear path where everything's documented from the Jira ticket and it's linked to whatever PR is committed to address these fixes. So that way you can share that information with your auditor and they have a very clear audit trail picture of the changes that occurred in your process for fixing them. The next common criteria I'm going to go over is around logical and physical access controls. This is really concerned about how your organization controls and implements logical and physical access to your cloud environments and what security measures you have in place to detect and prevent unauthorized access. And again, there's a lot of overlap between this common criteria and I haven't reviewed it yet, but later in this deck, I'll go through common criteria 9, but there's a lot of overlap between those two common criteria controls. Some examples of common criteria 6 things that you'd want to look into would be remote access control. So an example of this is ensuring that users, if they access your production site through a VPN, that one, the VPN is encrypted, and 2, it has MFA enabled on it. And also ensuring that only an employee with a business need actually has access to that production console. So for example, you'd want your on-call engineer to have that production access. But does someone in marketing need that type of access? Probably not, and they shouldn't have that access. A password management system. So ensuring, for example, that you have a strong password policy with 8 characters, complexity enabled, 90-day password change, enforces upper and lowercase letters, numbers, and then after someone tries to log in after 5 times, for example, that they're no longer able to access and log into the system. Another example is access reviews. So for example, making sure that employees have least privileged access. Similar to the first example I gave, like does your marketing or sales department need access to your production database? Probably not, and they shouldn't have it. Does the on-call engineer need it? Yeah, and they probably should be granted temporary access while they're on call. And then once they're no longer on call, that access revoked. Having an access removal process. So as employees come and go from your organization, ensuring that their leftover credentials are actually disabled and they no longer have access to your production, email, Slack, whatever tooling you have, just really make sure that you disable their access. And then another example is preventing unauthorized access to your production environment using security groups. The next common criteria that I'm going to review is around system and operations. And this defines really around your network and vulnerability scanning, as well as your system monitoring and tracking. So for example, if someone tries to access your production database and it's an unauthorized user, do you get a notification about that? If your production database suddenly becomes unavailable, do you receive an alert and do you get notified about that? Security events also need to be logged and tracked, resolved, and communicated to different parties. So having that clearly defined is very, very important. And again, common criteria 7 overlaps other different of the common criteria controls, such as the vulnerability assessment and remediation program, and then your security incidents response plan. Common criteria 8 is change management. And this really deals with how your organization evaluates and determines necessary changes with your infrastructure, data, software, and procedures. And also ensuring that you give your employees the ability to securely make changes and prevent any unauthorized changes. So for example, a great example of this is making sure that within Jira, for example, any production changes you're making, you have tickets for them. Your tickets then link to your different PR releases in your GitHub account, for example. And then you ensure as those tickets go through that they go through your change board, they get approval. Once the tickets are ready to be released to production, they're all linked together. So you know everything that's part of your production release. And then ensuring that all functionality within that release is actually tested and documented before you deploying it to production. And then the last step in all of this is ensuring that you inform your customers of this production release or change, and as well as your internal users. And the big reason why you want to have all that so well defined through the whole process is then your SOC 2 auditor is going to ask to see this information, and they want to make sure you have it all clearly defined. It's easy to follow and track, and you could pull up a ticket in Jira, see what the associated release was, see what the link, the PR was that got pushed out to production. It just makes it very easy from an auditing perspective. The last of the common criteria is risk mitigation. And this is really around defining and performing annual risk assessments and ensuring that you do this very regularly. So, and again, there's a lot of overlap between common criteria 6 and 9, but I'm only going to review the common criteria that's specific to common criteria 9 and doesn't have overlap with common criteria 6. And some of the areas with common criteria 9 with risk mitigation that you'd want to look into is maintaining a list of critical third-party vendors, what your requirements are for those third-party vendors to maintain their own security policies and procedures. I recommend ensuring that they have their SOC 2 audit completed if you're going to be using any third-party vendor that's critical to your production account. And then finally, again, annually reviewing your critical third-party vendors to ensure that they're maintaining their security posture and following the correct standards. And yeah, so again, this is just really, really around ensuring that your third-party critical vendors that have access to your production or are vital to your production running are secure and following the same best practices that you yourself are doing by going through the SOC 2 audit. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Wayne now to give some best practices and pitfalls to avoid.
Right. Excuse me. Thank you, Amelia. Yeah, wanted to start to wrap up here with talking about some best practices, some things that we've learned, and hopefully some things that you can avoid. And we'll start with the first one. You want to engage your auditor early in the process. You don't necessarily know what you don't know, and that's not a great place to be in. That's the job of the auditor. You could, in some cases, you may start down a path. You may find it's the wrong path. You may focus on the wrong things first. There are certain aspects of SOC 2 that are more critical than others, even though they're all certainly important. An auditor will tell you sort of the highest priority things, medium, and so forth. And just recognize that you're not alone in the process, and bringing an auditor in early will help you just overall in the entire journey. And especially if this is your first SOC 2, you almost certainly want to perform a readiness assessment. I did not speak to a single auditor who did not recommend this if you are performing your first. And then the other piece of advice that I've heard is to focus on security, and I definitely agree with that. Unless you have a specific business need to focus on any of the other pillars, security is where you want to start. Security, as you just heard, is across 9 very large, quite complex and overlapping common criteria, and there's plenty of work to do there. And by the end of that, you will have your gap report in hand, and you're under no obligations to share that. That's just for you. That's for you to begin your remediation. Now, again, focus on security unless you have a good reason to include others. Be open kimono. Be frank. Be very open with your auditors. They're there to help. Don't mislead them. If there's an issue that you're aware of, tell them, even if they don't think to ask. So, for example, if they ask, do you have encryption at rest turned on in your database? Well, the answer may very well be yes, and that's fantastic. But let's say you don't encrypt all of your log files, or you know of a bucket in a storage bucket somewhere that does not have encryption turned on. That's something you can be honest about, and you can say, yes, databases are turned on, but we have this other issue we need to address. And that's a good practice all around, to just be very open with your auditors. You will be bringing the business side into the interviews. This is not just about tech, as I'm sure you've now figured out. You will be interviewed on HR processes. You'll be interviewed on what your board is doing. You'll be probably asked to provide evidence that they're meeting on a certain frequency. Those kinds of things are non-technical in nature. And make sure everyone who might be interviewed has the ability to join. Now, these interviews typically span a day or two on site with a few select folks from your organization, and try to make the process as smooth as possible. Try to make sure everybody is available and can shift things around as quickly as they can to accommodate the auditors and get them all the information they need while they're on site. Realize that technology does not equal security. Remember that encryption is strong, but people are weak. There was a Google study in 2016 that found that 50% of people who find thumb drives in the parking lot will attempt to use them. This is how viruses and bad code get into air-gapped systems, because people do this, whether they scan them or not. Policy, process, due diligence, those things can be more important than the technology you select, as we learned, for example, in the first common criteria with setting the tone at the very top. Your organization needs a champion. This process is likely not going to work so smoothly as a design by committee. You need someone to be a point of contact between you and your auditors. You need someone to coordinate. You need someone to be the person the auditors go to. You need someone to spearhead make sure we turn on encryption at rest on our log files, even though we have features X, Y, and Z to wrap up. That kind of thing only works when you have a champion in your organization. Train for a data breach. Unfortunately, these days, as we all heard in the news, it's probably not a question of, probably a question of when, and not if. Unfortunately, create an incident response plan. Not only is it a good idea, but it's also a part of SOC and you will be asked about it. Host a game day where you pose security incidents that you learn from. Propose situations and scenarios that your organization needs to react to, needs to figure out how to contain those breaches and fix the problems. And at the same time, if you identify issues in your response plan or in your processes, take note of that. Create tickets, track them, fix them. All of that stuff will be asked. You'll be asked to provide evidence for. And finally, maybe a little anticlimactic, but fill out a standard questionnaire. Your customers, if they're security conscious, will ask you to fill out their security questionnaires, and a lot of folks will accept a standard one, such as the CAIQ, happily referred to as CAKE, and the STIG. Those are two well understood, well respected standard questionnaires that a lot of organizations will accept. I will tell you they are the epitome of a love-hate relationship. However, they will tell you more about your organization than anything else. And especially if you use one of these two, the CAKE or the STIG, they are mapped to several, at least the CAKE is for sure, the STIG as well, yeah. They're mapped to several other compliance frameworks. And so you might sort of be assessing yourself against other criteria, other compliance families that you may not necessarily want to address now, but it will help inform those efforts later. And self-assessment is also an aspect of SOC. So that's it. Pretty simple, right? So why don't let me end the best practices and pitfalls. I'm going to open it up now for questions, and I'm going to also turn it back over to Drew.
Thanks, Wayne and Amelia. We've got a couple questions here, and if you want to get a question in, now's the time to do it. First up, we have, can I skip type 1 and go straight to type 2? I think that might be for you, Wayne.
Yeah, sure. So skipping type 1 and going straight to type 2, that's a totally valid option. If this is your first, if this happens to be your first SOC 2 audit, I definitely recommend, like we talked about, going through a readiness review, a readiness assessment. Let the outcome of that assessment be your guidance on whether you should perform a type 1. There's no requirement that you go in order. The order does not have to be readiness, type 1, and type 2. You can skip type 1. You may have a customer requirement that says, we need you to be SOC 2 certified as quickly as possible, and SOC 2 type 1 is the fastest path to getting there. So you may have that as a requirement. It's also optional in the sense that if you decide you want to skip type 2, depending on your gap report from your readiness review, you may opt to do a type 1 because it serves as a useful sort of gut check before you go through the more thorough process of a type 2.
Okay, I think this one also might be for you, Wayne. Can you expand a bit on having a standard questionnaire?
Sure. What I mean by having one just means that you have gone through the work of downloading the CAIQ or the STIG. I'll tell you that the STIG has a price associated with it. The CAIQ is free from the CSA website. And when you go there, you download this very large, very intimidating looking spreadsheet, and it will ask you questions that are driven straight off of what is called the Cloud Controls Matrix, which is also put out by the CSA. And those questions will ask you things that are also mapped to SOC principles, the SOC criteria. And it will answer the questions for things like, do you have a risk management program in place? You would answer yes, no. You can provide, there's a section for providing your own notes. If you happen to have one and you have it publicly available, you can stick a link to that. If your answer happens to be no, that will start to inform you about what your own gaps are. So doing a self-assessment and having that on the shelf is a way of, one, like I said, performing that self-assessment because you need to do that for SOC anyway. And then two, if a customer says, hey, we have security questions, can you answer them? Oh, and by the way, we also accept the CAIQ or the STIG. If you're comfortable with taking that copy of your CAIQ or the STIG and handing it to them under an NDA, then the work is already done as far as fulfilling that question from your customer.
Okay. One question here is it okay for us to just do the security pillar and not do the other pillars? Maybe that might be for Amelia.
Yeah, I can take that, Drew. Yeah, the security pillar is the only required pillar of the SOC 2 audit. And you have to do the security pillar if you, in addition to any of the other pillars, if you want to do it. You really need to evaluate based on your business needs on whether or not the other pillars kind of fit your need as a business.
Okay. This one could probably be for either of you. Just what was your biggest takeaway going through the SOC 2 audit, and anything you would have done differently or that you think you did well that you want to share?
I could take a crack at that, Amelia.
Sounds good.
So one of the biggest realizations for me, my background is mostly in engineering, and as DevSecOps has started to become a thing over the years, it's not necessarily what I learned and what I was trained in. So the biggest sort of realization for me was that point earlier about technology does not equal security. Social engineering is very much alive and well. It can be very easy, depending on how you work through people, how you hack humans, to bypass all manner of security, of technological security, I should say. So over the last few years, and especially with an assessment, with an engagement and assessment of our own, it's something that we're learning more and more all the time. And that for me is probably one of the biggest takeaways given my background. What do you think, Amelia?
Yeah, I would say kind of for me at least, it was less technical than I was expecting it to be. And it was really more around your business processes and documenting and showing them the processes that you have in place and just providing a lot of evidence of that.
Okay. One we have here is how do you go about preparing the business employees, the business side of the house for the SOC 2 audit?
I could take that one, Wayne. As far as, again, the business portion of it is literally just their day-to-day and them describing what their day-to-day looks like, and then demonstrating, again, with documentation. So for example, HR, ensuring that new employees go through a background check, making sure that you have an organizational chart, make sure that you have jobs and descriptions documented, just talking through all that kind of day to day and what it looks like for them. And honestly, the best thing is for them to, one, try to be in the office or be on site for the interview. It makes the process a lot easier. And two, just relax and just kind of answer their questions. There's nothing scary or anything that's too outside of their realm day to day that they need to worry about.
Okay. We have a couple of questions that are similar, and I'll try to just combine into one, which is, do you have any recommendations on evaluating the auditors that you choose, and can you interview them before the audit process starts? And just generally about how you go about choosing your auditing firm.
Sure, I can take that. So I definitely recommend reaching out to a handful of auditors. Don't pick the first one you come across. And really it's about having a conversation with them. So they will likely want to schedule a second meeting, kind of a follow-up with a proposal. But the first person you talk to will likely have a canned set of slides they can walk you through. And that's all great information. Take lots of notes, find out if you happen to have a particular service or a system that you have. I'm trying to think how to phrase this correctly. If for your service, your software, the thing you're trying to sell to customers, auditors also have are partnered with other customers that may be able to use the service that you provide. And so that's a very valid question to ask when you're talking about your system and how you do business. Do they have any customers that can use services that you provide? And that's a very common thing to build this build this sort of network with a common with a common touch point of being an auditor. So that's something you do want to ask about. As far as just sort of other tips, find out from your financial folks. Find out from your CFO who does the financial audits for your company. They may do SOC2 audits themselves. There are a handful of CPA firms that also perform SOC2 audits, and you can also use them. Reach out to those folks because they may have colleagues who they could recommend as well. So a few things, that can help you in the selection process.
Okay. How many times do you have to take the SOC2 audit?
So really, I almost want to say it's up to you. The gold standard is that type 2 over a 12-month period. And typically you would need to get sort of certified, I shouldn't say every year, but you can. And what that tells your customers and tells everyone in the industry, is other vendors and things, is that you're sort of have this rolling window of being certified with the proper safeguards in place. But it like I said, it is really up to you, and it also depends on what your appetite for risk is. It depends on what your customer requirements are. If a customer says, "Are you SOC 2 certified?" and you hand them an audit from 3 years ago, they may or may not accept that. So it's really dependent upon, like I said, your appetite for risk, because technology changes, attacks change. You may develop new products that may also need to be, that those boundaries need to be looked at, how they're safeguarded. So it is very dependent on how you're doing business and what your requirements are.
So I'll actually add a question to that, Wayne. Would you say, like, for companies that in which SOC 2 is really important, would you recommend just kind of having SOC 2 be an ongoing process as opposed to something that you kind of fire up and then you're done with for a while?
That is certainly a really nice way of showing that you are in constant compliance and you are always thinking about your customer security. It's a great way to build that trust. That's certainly the intention of a lot of companies, and I know I have a couple of colleagues who are doing that now. They've done a 6-month, they're working on their 12-month, and then they just intend to have this rolling window where they're essentially showing that they are constantly in compliance.
Okay, great. One question is from somebody who they have a lot of different cloud environments at their organization, and are all of those treated the same under SOC 2? Are there any recommendations on how they can prioritize where they focus on bringing their IT infrastructure into compliance?
So in the eyes of SOC, the nice thing about SOC and some frameworks that are out there, some families, they're really kind of sort of technology agnostic. It's really a question of what controls do you have in place to address the rules that are laid out in the family. For example, we talked earlier about encryption at rest. So that's dependent on what encryption what encryption algorithm you're using, or what service are you using. I mentioned AWS KMS. If you use Azure, you're using their equivalent. In the case of identity and access management, you might use an identity federation service. You might use AWS IAM. You might use Azure IAM. So really, in the eyes of SOC, cloud is just another tool, and really it's all around the controls and the safeguards that you are putting in place to address the concerns and the risks to your business.
Okay. So Paul's coming in with a last minute question here. Can I exclude something like G Suite that contains company data but no customer data? something like AWS hosting production site, that would obviously be included. Let's at least just take that first one. If you have a G Suite that's just only company data but no customer data, is that involved in SOC 2 or can that be excluded?
That can be excluded. SOC is, so it also depends on what you're storing there. Are you storing anything about your customers in G Suite? Are you storing your contracts there? So SOC is looking at where your customer data is stored and how it's secured. So just by a strict definition of the SOC, G Suite wouldn't necessarily be included unless you are also storing any customer data there. So you would need to take a look at the data you are actually storing there and determine if it really is physically separate. If it's only company data, you don't necessarily need to include that in a SOC, but I would recommend looking at it from sort of a risk management perspective where, you know, if the data that's in my G Suite were to leak out because of bad permissions, or I accidentally allowed public sharing of a folder in G Drive, you know, does that hurt my company? So it may not impact you from a SOC perspective, but from a company and a you doing business perspective, it's that is still very important, but it can be excluded from SOC, it sounds like.
Okay. And would encryption at rest be a hard and fast requirement for SOC 2?
These days, the encryption at rest is basically table stakes these days. You can't really come to play without encryption at rest anymore.
I will go ahead and take that as a yes. So that's all the questions that we have. And if you have any additional questions about SOC 2 in general, or about Fugue, you can shoot us an email. You can go ahead and use that sales@fugue.co for any of those, since we've got that up on the screen. And obviously want to throw a little pitch out there about Fugue. Fugue can identify SOC 2 violations in your cloud infrastructure environment within 10 minutes, as well as give you information on each of those that will be helpful in bringing those into compliance and correcting them. We can have a free workshop with you to take a look at your environment and show you how Fugue can help you not only bring that environment into compliance, but ensure it stays that way, and identify any kind of drift from compliance as it happens. And if you're just the type that wants to get your hands on a product, you can start a free trial with Fugue at www.fugue.co/go. And in about 10 minutes, you're going to get a beautiful visualization of your infrastructure environment, and we'll show you where your compliance problems exist. So give that a try. And again, thank you so much for taking some time with us today.